Today we're going to be looking at Charizard EX and putting it in the spotlight for the World Championships in Honolulu, Hawaii in 2024. Charizard has been a top performer all year. It's been in the top 5 of decks in every format that it's been in so far, and once again in Shrouded Fable it feels like there are some good cards that could be going into the deck to improve it as well. Let's talk about the general strategy of Charizard first of all then, and we are a multiple stage 2 deck. We are looking to try and rare candy into both our Pidgeot EX and our Charizard EX. As soon as you get Pidgeot online, you can search your deck every turn for one card. That's such a powerful effect that it means you have a lot of control over the game by simply getting the best card for the right situation. Typically though, as soon as you candy into a Pidgeot, that's going to help you grab a piece that then allows you to candy into Charizard, because as soon as you go into Charizard, you're able to search your deck for 3 basic fire energy and attach them to your Pokemon in any way that you like. Of course, a lot of the time you're going to be putting 2 of those energies onto the Charizard itself, powering itself up for that Burning Darkness attack. That is the main attack that we are trying to utilize within the deck. Doesn't seem that astounding on the offset with just 180 damage, but it is 30 more for each prize card your opponent has taken, and that means that Charizard has this amazing late game situation where very often as the opponent goes down to 4 and 5 prize cards, that Charizard is getting easy one-hit KOs on the entirety of the format. So the real identity of the archetype is trying to use our ball search cards in the opening stages, our Buddy Buddy Poffins, our Nest Balls, and of course the Arven Supporter, a crucial one here, to get our multiple stage 2s into play. We're quite set up focused, so we do rely on the likes of Rotom V to end our opening turns on instant charges so we can gain some card advantage, hoping to have these powerful turn 2 candy combinations. Knowing that even if we are submitting early prize cards on some of our evolving basics, it's only going to be 1 prize at a time, and ideally that means that we have that time to develop our board and work towards this late game where Charizard EX itself is of course a fantastic attacking threat, but also we're going to be in control of that quick search, so should be able to grab things like Iono, Counter Catcher, these cards that allow us to be behind and actually capitalize on the fact that we are behind and pull some combos together. And we also have a great Radiant attacking Pokemon in Radiant Charizard, which is a very high damage output, again late game focus card where its attack cost is reduced for each prize card your opponent has taken. And of course we can use this card to try and offset a prize race. If your opponent is on even prize cards remaining, you can use this in the late game, hopefully hand destruct at the same time, and make it so that your opponent has to have a boss's orders, as well as other combinations like re-establishing an attacker to actually close out those final couple of prize cards. Let's have a look at a very basic skeleton then of what a Charizard EX deck looks like. At the moment there's a 3-1-2 line of Charizard EX. I think this is on the slimmer side, but as we get to the deck list later you'll see that some lists will be incorporating just the 3-1-2, because we are trying to squeeze a lot into the deck, but we also have that 2-0-2 Pidgeot EX line. Of course the 4 rare candy are going to come up trumps here so that we can still get into that Pidgeot EX. You'll notice we are on strictly 70 hit point Charmander and strictly 60 hit point Pidgey. That's because there is a lot of bench pressure in the format right now, with Dragapult EX sometimes being copied by Regidrago or just attacking itself. From Shrouded Fable there is also the Dusclops, which can place 5 counters on one of your Pokemon with a Cursed Blast ability, so having the higher hit point basics is really integral here. We have a couple really nice setup V Pokemon in the Rotom, like I just mentioned, as well as Lumineon V, which can search the deck for a supporter card. Both of these have great synergy with the Forest Seal Stone tool, which is in the deck, which is the reason why we have 4 copies of Arven in the deck list. Flipping our V-Star marker with this Forest Seal Stone gives us a great way into these candy combinations with Pidgeot and Charizard. And when our openings haven't been all that powerful, we can even flip that V-Star marker on turn 1 just to get things like Buddy Buddy Poffin going in the game. We're maximizing counts of Ultra Ball, Buddy Buddy Poffin, and Rare Candy. These are no-brainers in the list. And we have a couple of Super Rods to recover our Pokemon, as well as energy, because we are playing quite a thin count, knowing that we can always pull them out the deck with an Infernal Rain from Charizard. The skeleton in front of you is very bare bones, and I'm going to be going into more detail with 3 deck lists today, so stay tuned for those. First of all, let's have a quick look at Charizard's matchup data in the Twilight Masquerade format. The data in front of you is from Trainer Hill, and it's from the entire month of July, and this is of course before Shrouded Fable's released, so you might see some of these percentages shifting, and I'll talk about that when we get into the nitty-gritty of the deck lists, as well as the matchup guide as well. But you'll notice the matchup spread wasn't too shabby actually in Twilight Masquerade. Gardevoir was the best performing deck, and Charizard performs quite well into Gardevoir, whilst also being pretty even into Lugia and Lost Zone Box, the other sort of top contenders in the metagame, and you were quite happy to see a strong Raging Bolt matchup as well, as it was also a popular archetype. As ever, you're still happy to see the Miraidon matchups, and you were very happy facing the Ancient boxes. The more awkward matchups were Dragapult variants, Chien-pao Baxcalibur, as well as the two controlling decks, Pidgeot and Snorlax, and the elephant in the room, the Regidrago V-Star. It was relatively acceptable going into the NAIC to have a bad Regidrago matchup, but there is a lot of hype generated around this archetype now that Shrouded Fable is released, as Regidrago does gain a couple crucial cards. So having a high-profile, very bad matchup is a hurdle that Charizard is going to have to overcome going into the World's metagame. It's not all bad news for Charizard though. Even though Regidrago gains a few big cards that is a high-profile bad matchup, Charizard itself gains a whole trove of cards as well from this expansion. And today we're going to look at 3 different builds that I've made in the Shrouded Fable metagame, capitalizing on some of these new inclusions. First of all, let's look at the Dusclops Dusknoir, the Cursed Blast package here. The main benefit of this evolution line coming into the list is that Cursed Blast forces the opponent to take a prize card, because these Pokemon knock themselves out whilst placing counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon. That means that the low damage output of 180 from Burning Darkness can immediately ramp up to 210 damage, and if we're using the Cursed Blast damage counters from Dusclops, for example, on the second turn of the game, you can immediately be KOing basic EXs and V Pokemon, whilst also unlocking Countercatcher, one of the most dangerous item cards when you're behind on prizes. It's not just turn 2, of course. We can use these Dusclops and Dusknoir to tick ourselves over into one-hit KOs, into V-Star Pokemon in the mid-game, for example, or even into other Stage 2 EXs like Dragapult and Charizard in mirror match situations. Dusknoir, with a 13 damage counter placement, can be much more tricky as well. You can KO some like evolving Pokemon on your opponent's bench whilst taking out their active with your attack. For example, you could use Dusknoir to do a 1-for-1 prize trade into your opponent's Frigibax, then you could use a Countercatcher on their Baxcalibur on a board state where a Chien-pao is normally quite comfortable having one Baxcalibur and a Frigibax just in case the Baxcalibur's KO'd. Now Dusknoir is able to target that Frigibax, then the Baxcalibur can be removed from play all in one turn, and your opponent is then left without a board. Equally, with 13 damage counters, you can also try and take out crucial engine Pokemon, for example Radiant Greninja or Bibarel, whilst once again taking out a key attacking threat with your Charizard, so that once again their board is depleted, and that becomes much more powerful with the help of Iono and Unfair Stamp. Another important use of this Dusclops Dusknoir package is that you can use the Cursed Blasts to KO Mimikyu, when the deck typically doesn't have many great answers for this Pokemon. Also, in some controlling matchups, if you're feeding the opponent and making them take prize cards, it might mean that their own counter-style cards, like their own Countercatchers, aren't going to be online for certain turns in the game, allowing you to just remain in the active swinging with your Charizard. And because they're now going to be taking prize cards even if they don't want to, Radiant Charizard is also reducing its attack costs, so could get into the mix as an attacking threat as well. Let's have a look at a Dusknoir 60 then. You can see the 13 cards that were added into the skeleton list. For Pokemon, it's a 1-1-1 line of Dusknoir. Now, I have seen as thick as 2-1-1 lines of Dusknoir, just so you can develop double Duskull in certain situations. But for now, I'm just with the thin package. I've also included the 1-1 Bibarel, which we have seen in previous builds of Charizard before, giving you a backup engine that's most notably a single prize Pokemon. We've also included the new Pheasantipede EX as a 1-count here, giving us even more draw power from ability Pokemon. We've added one new supporter card in the Thornton option. This card is really flexible, of course, and is another great way that we can try and fix our board. These Rotom and Luminion that find their way onto the board can be removed and exchanged for a more helpful basic Pokemon. And of course, bear in mind that we could use this to have surprise situations where a Dusklops can be built out of nowhere. And against some archetypes like Regidrago, V-Star and Dragapult, we can a little bit more safely get into a Candy Pidgeot by using a Thornton to get rid of one of your higher hit point basic Pokemon, turning it into a Pidgey and then candying up to Pidgeot. So it really is a multifaceted card in this deck list and opens up all sorts of lines of play. The A-spec we've gone for is the Unfair Stamp. Still a great defensive card to have at your disposal. We are playing one copy of the Night Stretcher. We're at such a thin line of the Charizard, I thought this was worthwhile including, just to give you instant access to one of those pieces, whilst also sometimes weaving in as another way to get Radiant Charizard back. It can also make the Thornton much more realistic, where you can go Thornton straight back into a Dusclops as well with this combination. And there's extra benefit, for example, Arven now can grab an energy card, provided you've discarded one throughout the game. I've also added one copy of Hisuian Heavy Ball. I like this card more and more in the Shrouded Fable format, especially in Charizard, because we are just playing a huge amount of one-of copy of basics. In this decklist, there are 7 basic one-ofs, as well as just a 2-count in the Pidgey and 3 of Charmander. So all in all, it gets a lot of value, and again is an Arvenable target once you've done your first deck search. Defiance Band also has great synergy with the Cursed Bombers, which can give your opponent prize cards so that you can ramp your damage output even further, and was already just a solid card in Charizard to begin with. And we round out the skeleton by including an extra copy of the Counter Catcher as well as Nest Ball. Next up, we're coming on to what I like to call the Nest Ball package, and that's to say that we are increasing our Nest Ball count substantially here. We're going up to 4 copies rather than the 1 count that I have in the skeleton list, and that generally just improves your early game consistency. It means that you can go first into a number of matchups more comfortably, knowing you can still get some basics developed and even end on a Rotom, for example. But it also means going second into some of the more dangerous matchups, like Regidrago V-Star now, of course, because they do represent turn 2 spread pressure. Having these early game ball search cards in a plenty allows you to get your engine Pokemon down, multiple Charmander established, hopefully Manaphy as well, and ending on the likes of Rotom is incredible. So naturally, just lots of Nest Ball, because it's one of the best cards you can see in your opening hands, always a good bonus. The other thing to bear in mind that with the new Pheasantipity EX, the Nest Ball's value doesn't diminish. It still becomes a very powerful card to see, even as you're drawing through the deck into the sort of mid-game stages and using Iono and such, just naturally seeing these Nest Balls. Having them turn into Pheasantipity or turn into Radiant Charizard is still great news. So the card is still powerful even as you draw throughout the game, thanks to the new inclusion of Pheasantipity EX. And I'm also playing Gouging Fire in this deck list. The idea around this approach is to have a turn 2 proactive attacking option that can KO, essentially a card that does more than 180 damage, similar to trying to do a Cursed Bomb play. We're trying to get to 260 damage immediately via a Gouging Fire, so that we can proactively KO some basic V and EX Pokemon, most notably the likes of Lugia and Regidrago V-Star. Whilst at the same time, Gouging Fire doesn't have an ability, of course, so it offers a Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon EX answer, which has been showing up in a number of archetypes as of late as a headache to Charizard, so having a natural counter within the list is also welcomed. So for this 60 then, we are still playing the 1/1 line of Bibarel. I'm still a massive fan of it when I can weave it in. We add in the 2 basics of Pheasantipity EX as well as Gouging Fire EX. The additional supporter this time around is Kieran, and that's because we need to have more ways to deal 330 damage in mirror match situations and up against Dragapult EX, whilst at the same time offering an extra switching card in the deck list, which can be really important for the Gouging Fire and Radiant Charizard, both of which can't attack again next turn. Following along that theme, my ace spec is Prime Catcher. Again, I do like having the extra means of pivoting, but this is just a great card that we can search out with the Arven, opting to go for Prime Catcher over a second copy of Counter Catcher in this case, because the idea around the decklist is to try and be proactive in situations when we can be. Again, there are 7 individual basic Pokemon, so Hisuian Heavy Ball once again makes the cut. We also have the Defiance Band once again as an Arven target, and you can see the remaining 5 slots go towards increasing our Charizard count back up to 413, as well as bolstering that Nest Ball count all the way up to 4. The final list I wanted to discuss in more detail was Pecharunt EX. Now, I haven't actually seen many murmurings around this combination, but I do think there are a couple really big selling points around this package. The new Binding Mochi tool combines really nicely with the subjugating chains of the Pecharunt, so that we can poison our Dark-type Terrestrial Charizard EX and really improve that Burning Darkness math. If your opponent hasn't taken any prizes, you can still deal 220, which is still that crucial threshold for the likes of Lugia, Regidrago, Ogerpons, Chien-paos, all of those relevant basics. And after your opponent has taken 2 prizes, having 4 remaining, you can now reach up to 280 damage. That's massive into the V-Star matchups like Lugia and Regidrago, but also 280 should stand out as a great way for you to deal with Pidgeot EX from your opponent. In the mirror, having control over who has Pidgeot is one of the biggest factors you can have here, so giving yourself a turn earlier option of taking that KO is huge. Pecharunt EX also offers this great secondary bonus in the deck for having extra mobility, and I think this is crucial against what was previously one of your worst matchups in the block Snorlax archetype. Now you can constantly subjugating chains your Charizard back into the active position whenever your opponent is using those Counter Catcher or bossing trapping strategies on all of your benched Pokemon. Because Pecharunt is already doing such a great job at getting around the blocking strategy, we may as well fill the deck with answers to control, flipping 2 of our worst matchups. So I've deviated a little bit more from the Skeleton 60 in this case, because I have also cut the Professor Churro scenario and the Collapse Stadium. And that's because our bench is just going to have even more 2-prize Pokemon on it, with Pecharunt EX included in the deck list, knowing that we're going to use that Binding Mochi quite frequently. And for that reason, again, because our bench will be more full, there's actually no Bibarel in this list. We are just going to rely on Pidgeot as well as Pheasantipity EX. And the Churro also loses a ton of value because we naturally have the Pecharunt as our pivoting option. So instead, we include the Fezandipiti EX as well as the Pecharunt EX as our new Pokemon. We are playing one copy of Prime Catcher. I feel it's better than the Unfair Stamp in this case, because it means that you can still pivot a Pokemon even without board space for Pecharunt, whilst again being a proactive card that we can still gust with. We do have the Hisuian Heavy Ball. Again, there's 6-1 of basics, so we may as well have it in the list. It still seems valuable enough. Now we come to the sort of anti-control cards. There's one copy of Cancelling Clone, which can allow us to get through Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon EX as well as Mimikyu. One copy of Lost Vacuum, so we can get rid of hit point buffing tools on those Pokemon, whilst also bouncing awkward stadium cards and such. We have the 2 Binding Mochi, which is of course the damage modifier here, and the 2 supporters we've included is the Silene as well as Team Yell's Cheer, kind of reminiscent of Tord's first place list from the EUIC this season. Silene's flexibility of recovery alongside the Team Yell's Cheer should give us plenty of answers to the controlling decks, even if they are using their Misfortune Sisters and Eries to target our item cards. The big upside of Team Yell's Cheer just generally is that it can recover the extra copies of Boss's Orders or Ionos that we require in other matchups. Another cool thing to point out is that Silene does have extra synergy within this list because of Fezandipiti EX in the list now, so you can gain that instant access without committing your quick search. And good news for this list as well, because Collapse Stadium has less value, I've just changed it to a Temple of Sinnoh, which gives you bonus points into the Lugia matchup. And we're still trying to make space where we can for Nest Ball. Pecharunt is obviously part of our combo for a turn 2 play, so you want to still have a high count here, as well as a slightly thicker line of the Charizard once again. Now I just want to take a moment to talk more in detail about the matchups. Let's start off with Regidrago V-Star. This was one of your weakest matchups in the previous format, and they gained the new Kyurem as an attacking threat, as well as their own use of Fezandipiti EX, so they are less vulnerable to late game Iono plays. I definitely still fear this matchup, and I don't think it's favoured for Charizard, because not only can they represent great bench pressure to your engine Pokemon like Pidgey and Bidoof, but they also have easy means of KOing your Charizard thanks to the Teal Mask Ogerpon EX. You would be opting to go first into this matchup when you have the chance, and all 3 of the deck lists I showed do have means of taking proactive prizes in that matchup, and if you are able to pull off one of those turn 2 KOs in whatever means necessary, you're going to be quite far ahead. The one caveat I do have to that is that if you're using the Dusknoir line and have to Dusclops to reach into a KO, it's very likely that a Regidrago can still take a 3 prize turn back into you, either with a Cancelling Cologne play with Kyurem, or with a Dragapult EX plus Horlucha combination, whilst taking out one of your engine Pokemon like Lumineon or Rotom. So if you're playing the Dusknoir package, it is really important to deny that line of play with Collapse Stadium when you can. Going second is where things get a lot more tricky for the matchup. Very often I want to try and develop Bidoof and prioritise that over Pidgey, whilst at the same time, of course, we are often looking to get our Manaphy developed. Even with Manaphy and Bidoof down, it is possible for your opponent to still carve out a 2 prize turn, either by gusting the likes of Rotom or Lumineon, Dragapult plus Horlucha combinations, or a dreaded Kyurem play. The main hope from there is simply to keep up by taking 2 prizes in response with counter catcher plays. Certainly trying to target Ogerpon with tons of energy on them, or your opponent's Fezandipiti is going to be a big deal here, because if they have taken those 2 prizes before you've taken any, your likely catch-up win condition is going to be weaving in Radiant Charizard with late-game hand disruption, bearing in mind that Regidragos can get KO'd by Radzard with Defiance Band still. Next up, we have the Gardevoir matchup. It's actually entirely different in that we are likely going to be the aggressor in this occasion. We often don't have to worry about Manaphy, but have a relative awareness of Screamtail getting into the mix at times. The main headaches come in the form of annoying walling options like Mimikyu, as well as the neutralization zone from Shrouded Fable, and their likelihood to weave in TM Devolution in their strategy, using the likes of that Mimikyu, Fluttermane, and Monkey Dory to set up multiple Pokemon for a big swing turn, picking up our Charizard and Pidgeot in one go. Generally, our strategy is still going to revolve around trying to take out Curliers proactively, via those Prime Catchers, Boss's Orders, and be aware that if your opponent is trying to wall with Mimikyu, we can even power up the Fezandipiti EX as a sniping threat on our own side, Cruel Arrow dealing 100 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon. Gardevoir will very rarely develop Manaphy against you, and if your opponent is trying to take a slower approach with that Mimikyu, you can heavily punish this with Fezandipiti. In this matchup, it's going to be really important to be aware of your Charmeleon, your Professor Churro scenario, your Collapse Stadium at times. If you're playing the Dusknoir, know that that can be your means around Mimikyu as well. And generally, my golden rule is always take out the Curliers. I'm not even that worried about Monkey Dory. If Monkey Dory is doing its thing, that means your opponent has a Gardevoir EX in play, and that means you have avenues to 2 prize turns yourself. Overall, I think Gardevoir remains a positive matchup for Charizard. Next up, we have Lugia V-Star. I think some of the biggest challenges for us is that, of course, Chinchino can get those one-hit KOs with the special roll, committing a bunch of energy to it. The Lugia deck plays a ton of gift energy, so your Ionos are not always functional, and if you're trying to dodge boss in late game scenarios, it can be difficult. and they have that annoying legacy energy to create even more uptrade situations. You're going to be opting first into the matchup because if ever you can get some free damage onto a Lugia or just taking a single prize KO, that's always going to be a huge benefit with a turn 2 Charizard. But going second, it's going to be all about that response play. If your opponent has taken just a 1 prize KO with a Tempest dive, you're very often going to be looking to get a counter catcher play onto an Archeops, ideally throwing an Unfair Stamp or an Iono at them at the same time. As soon as one Archeops is taken out, the deck immediately becomes a lot less aggressive against you and you have a lot more time to control their board. The Chinchinos become far less of a problem. You might have to still go through one, and you're not always going to win a conventional prize race here, but sometimes running your opponent out of their high damage threats just by virtue of how many energy have gone, or by how quickly they can use their chops, that's going to bring things a little bit more into your favour where the Charizards can tank once again. It's another matchup where you really want to be using your Churro and your Collapse Stadium to deny a Lugia V-Star from taking an easy boss 2 prize KO on some of your lower hit point multi-prizes. The Raging Bolt matchup remains very favourable for us. I think having some awareness that Ogerpon can be an attacking threat in its own right is relevant, and be aware that they can play item catchers, not just the prime, but oftentimes flip catchers as well. Try and develop those double Charmanders, double Pidgey even if you can, so that your opponent can't just take away some of your engine pieces in one go. If your opponent's on even prizes, we know that Radiant Charizard is a monster in the deck. The matchup didn't get any more difficult really. I think the only thing to bear in mind is that they could easily be playing Pheasantipity EX, so giving that extra respect and dealing with it is going to be important. Next up, let's talk about the Block Snorlax matchup. This one's very different based on the 3 lists I provided. I think the general advice I can give on the whole is that they have so many ways of cheesing Pokemon into play via their Accompanying Flute and their Erika's Invitation. It's often worthwhile putting down some of your engine Pokemon like Pidgey, like Rotom, if it means that you will then have more tempo because of it. If you're putting down a Rotom so that you can Forest and Candy and start attacking, that seems fair enough to me. If you happen to start Charmander and you have a good enough hand to not need it to get going though, of course forcing your opponent to hit those Flutes and Erikas is going to be helpful here. It's also really important to keep track of your fire energy. You might need to have a decent amount for your Radiant Charizard as well as your Charizard EX as attacking threats. If you're playing the Dusknoir build, this matchup got a lot better for you because you can pop your Duskull and Dusklops. These can be used to KO Mimikyu, but just in general ramp your Charizard damage output. So now you can more aggressively KO their Rotom as well as Snorlax even with Bravery Charms. It also means that you might have a reprieve from Countercatcher for a longer period of the game. If you're playing the Nest Ball build, you might have a tricky time with the Mimikyu, but at least you have Gouging Fire to get around Cornerstone Ogerpon EX. If you're playing the Pecharunt EX build, I think you're in luck. We have chocked the deck full of answer cards for this matchup, and with Silene and Yelcher available, you should be able to get around the annoying walls they present, as well as, of course, an easy means around block with Pecharunt dancing your Charizard in and out. It's not that easy to talk in the Lost Zone box matchup, because everything is so dependent on what's within the box, but I would say that you're in those sort of fact-finding missions in the opening stages. I would definitely respect the option of Moonlight Shuriken, so would be developing Manaphy as early as possible. I'd be looking at my opponent's Lost Zone and trying to gain hints whether or not they play things like Darkness Energy for potential Roaring Moon, Fighting Energy for potential Cornerstone Ogerpon, or just like what sort of counts are showing up if they're on something similar to Hedrick's very heavy Vacuum Pokestop build, or does it look like they have elevated counts of like Sableye, for example, and maybe that could indicate a TM devolution. The general strategy for us is going to be playing defense, weaving in our Iono and Stamps when we can, and usually just relying on the bulk of Charizard to do the heavy lifting here. It's also worth pointing out that Iron Thorns is a card played, at least in Hedrick's most recent list, but all the lists I've provided have great ways of pushing the Thorns to the back anyway. Dragapult EX is somewhat of an interesting one. This was a negative matchup in the Twilight Masquerade format, but we have gained some new tricks in the list. If we're able to weave in our Cursed Blasts from Dusclops and Dusknoir, we should have easier reach into that Dragapult EX a little earlier with our Charizard, and we really want to condense the game down to as few turns as possible, because giving the Dragapult player extra Phantom Dives just gives them a bunch of value, whereas as we condense the game down ourselves with Curse Blast, that's when Charizard is becoming the more powerful attacker. We do have to be aware, of course, of Hawlucha plays. That could be a great way for them to punish even your 70 hit point basics, and it's likely they're also packing the TM devolution, so trying to weave in your Charmeleon is also really important here. I think the Chien-pao matchup is relatively similar. I think going first you have a bit higher win percentage, because now we can take that initial 2 prize KO in all the lists that you've seen today. Chien-pao is pretty much known for taking a 2-2-2 strategy the entire time, with one attacker or the other, so giving them a Cursed Bomb is like the last thing they want to see. Miraidon remains a really good matchup as well. I don't think anything changes about the deck list too much. Maybe have some awareness of the fact they could play Iron Thorns EX, so again, prioritizing your Gus is going to be important, and be aware that they could easily have Pheasantipity EX in the list, so have a bit more bounce back from Iono, but in general, I don't think this should be a big struggle for us. As for my closing thoughts then, as I said at the start of the video, Charizard has been a consistent performer this entire season, and that's because it still has some of the best engine Pokemon around it. With Pidgeot, with Bibarel, now with Pheasantipity EX as well, you just draw so many cards and can cherry pick ones at the right times. It means that you are dictating the pace of play and how things are panning out towards the late game stages, and that's exactly where Charizard is in control, with its ridiculous damage output. As much as I love Pheasantipity EX, and it's gone into all of the Charizard lists you've seen today, it's also going into a lot of the more aggressive decks, and because Charizard has to feel comfortable playing from behind, knowing that your Ionos may not be that powerful or reliable anymore is going to be important, so prioritizing taking out this engine Pokemon in particular is going to be really important in the mid-game for you. Each build today has looked to achieve a similar goal in that they're getting earlier pressure or have avenues to take early KOs. And I think that's really important, specifically for Shrouded Fable. In the past, I thought it was okay for Charizard to just punch things for 180, but specifically because Regidrago is so easily able to take 2 or 3 prize turns against these evolving decks, it feels really important to have a proactive strategy into this matchup because it's going to be a high-profile one at the World Championships. And from there, each of the 3 that I've offered have different perks. Dusknoir probably has the most payoffs, but the least consistency. The Quad Nest Ball has probably the most consistency, but the least secondary perks. And Pecharunt kind of sits in the middle of those two, where at least you'll get into control and have some proactive attacking threats. But also comes with the downside that it doesn't have Collapsed and Churro, so in late game situations, if your opponent just has the boss, they have it. The final thing I wanted to touch on was just really trending from the opening couple of days of tournaments we've seen in the online space, and that's that we are seeing lots of Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon, lots of Mimikyu, lots of neutralization zones. They're coming into decklists because they can be a headache for the Regidrago players, they can be a headache for the Charizard players in particular, so having some respect to those matchups I think is going to be important going into the World Championships. They were matchups that you could just about take an L2 in the previous format and still have decent tournament runs, but I'm not so sure that's going to be the case at Worlds. Let me know your thoughts on all 3 of the deck lists. Which has been your favourite to test with so far? Do you think Charizard has what it takes, but is the Regidrago matchup just putting you off right now? I'll hear your thoughts down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another one. Cheers.